The top 10 African warriors in history. They say history is written by the victors, but in Africa, history was often sung by griots, whispered in war cries, and etched into the iron of spears and the fire of rebellion. The world has long overlooked the tactical brilliance, military ingenuity, and unwavering courage of Africa's greatest warriors. For too long, Africa's martial past has been dismissed or diluted, reduced to shadows in the margins of textbooks. But these warriors were no shadows, they were storms. From the dusty plains of Carthage to the golden walls of Zazzau, from the thundering hooves of Ashanti cavalry to the quiet courage of a queen who faced Rome itself, Africa's battlefield history is nothing short of epic. These warriors did more than fight. They led, they inspired, they defied empires, and they stood even when the world tried to make them kneel. This is not a tribute to violence, it is a tribute to purpose, to people who took up arms not for greed or glory, but for freedom, survival, and dignity. Some built kingdoms, others defended them. Some resisted colonial invaders, others innovated warfare so profoundly that even modern generals study their tactics today. What ties them all together is their unrelenting courage and their love for their people. In this video, we journey through time to rediscover 10 of Africa's most legendary real-life warriors, men and women whose stories are not myths, but monuments. Each warrior in this list was selected for their verified historical impact, strategic brilliance, and contribution to African resistance or expansion. These are names that should echo through classrooms, conversations, and culture, not just in Africa, but across the world. So, sit back, open your mind, let the drums of history beat once more as we begin with a name that even the mighty Roman Empire never forgot. Hannibal Barca, the genius of Carthage. Before Napoleon, before Alexander, and long before modern warfare carved maps with missiles, there was Hannibal Barca. Born in 247 BCE in Carthage, what is now modern-day Tunisia, Hannibal was the son of Hamilcar Barca, a seasoned general who had fought against Rome in the First Punic War. As legend goes, a young Hannibal swore an oath to his father at the altar of Baal that he would never be a friend to Rome. He kept that promise with fury. Hannibal was not just a warrior, he was a military artist. When the Second Punic War broke out, he didn't just attack Rome from the front. No, he orchestrated one of the most daring campaigns in military history, leading an army that included elephants, cavalry, and mercenaries. Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees, traversed Gaul, and then stunned the world by taking his army through blizzards, mountains, and death across the Alps. It was a move that no one saw coming. Not then, not now. What followed were battles that still make the hairs on historians' necks stand up. At the Battle of Trebia, Hannibal lured Roman soldiers into an icy river ambush. At Lake Trasimene, he executed a perfectly timed ambush within the fog-covered valley, massacring thousands. But it was at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE that Hannibal revealed his true genius. Facing a Roman army twice his size, he allowed the center of his forces to appear weak and retreat, succoring the Romans in, while his cavalry and elite troops closed in from the sides. In a matter of hours, he annihilated over 50,000 Roman soldiers. Military academies around the world still study the double envelopment maneuver that Hannibal mastered that day. It wasn't just a win,
It was a lesson in psychological warfare, strategy, and audacity. But Hannibal's greatness didn't lie solely in his victories. It was in his resilience. For more than 15 years, he kept his army inside enemy territory, terrorizing the Roman heartland while never losing a major battle. Yet, political games back home in Carthage, a lack of reinforcements, and the eventual rise of Scipio Africanus led to his recall and eventual defeat at the Battle of Zama. Still, Rome feared him so deeply that even years after his exile, Roman senators would warn, "Hannibal is at the gates," whenever they sensed danger. He became a symbol, not just of war, but of the power of will, intellect, and unrelenting purpose. Hannibal wasn't African in the symbolic sense. He was African in the literal, historical, and undeniable sense. Born of Carthaginian nobility, educated in warfare, and shaped by a father who hated empire, Hannibal represents the high watermark of African strategic warfare. In a time when Europe was still fragmented and tribal, Africa birthed a general whose very name made Rome tremble. And though Carthage would eventually fall, Hannibal's name survived its ashes. He didn't just fight Rome, he haunted it. And that is why he begins our journey through Africa's greatest warriors. Not because he was first, but because he showed the world that Africa's mind, when sharpened by purpose, could reshape the balance of power across continents. From the Alps to the gates of Rome, Hannibal was more than a commander. He was a storm in human form.
2. Queen Amina of Zazzau, the Northern Storm. If Hannibal was a storm that swept across the Alps, Queen Amina was the lightning bolt that electrified the Sahel. From the deserts of modern-day Tunisia, we now travel south to the heart of Hausaland, where one of Africa's most legendary queens rode into history not on the back of myth, but on the back of a war horse. Her name was Amina, and she was no ordinary ruler. Born in the early 16th century in the city-state of Zazzau, now Zaria in northern Nigeria, Amina was the granddaughter of a powerful Hausa king and the daughter of Queen Bakwa Turunku. But even as a child, Amina was different. While other girls were trained in courtly customs and marriage protocols, Amina trained with the warriors. She sharpened blades, she studied tactics, she joined military drills. And by the time she came of age, she was not only heir to the throne, she was already commanding respect as a fierce fighter and strategist. When her mother died, Amina ascended to the throne. But she wasn't content to govern from the palace. Within months, she mounted her horse, raised her sword, and led her first military campaign, and then another and another. For the next 30 decades, Queen Amina of Zazzau would become one of the most feared and respected military leaders in West Africa. Her campaigns expanded the territory of Zazzau farther than any ruler before or after her. She conquered neighboring cities, secured vital trade routes, and established tributary states from the Niger River all the way to Kwara-Rafa. It is said that every town she conquered had to build a defensive wall, many of which are still referred to as Gunawar Amina, Amina's walls, to this day. But it wasn't just her victories that made her iconic, it was the way she led. Amina's army was vast, disciplined, and loyal. She reportedly commanded over 20,000 soldiers at her peak, many of whom were trained personally under her supervision. She wore armor into battle, she wielded weapons with expert skill, and she rode at the front of her columns, leading charges herself rather than commanding from a distance. In an era where women were often sidelined in governance and war, Amina defied expectations with every gallop, every sword stroke, and every diplomatic decision. Her reign wasn't just about war, it was about vision. Amina understood the value of economic power too.
She expanded trade links across the region, connecting the Hausa people with merchants from the trans-Saharan routes, increasing Zazzau's wealth and ensuring her kingdom's influence outlasted her own lifetime. And while written records are scarce, the oral traditions of Hausa griots have kept her memory burning bright for centuries. She became a cultural icon, a symbol of female leadership, and a point of pride in Nigeria's northern legacy. Even the famous Nigerian saying, "Amina, daughter of Nikotau, a woman as capable as a man," speaks volumes about how her people saw her, not just as a queen, but as a warrior equal to the greatest of men. But like many titans of history, Amina's story ends with mystery. Some legends say she died in battle, sword in hand, atop her horse. Others claim she died in one of her conquered cities, cut down by betrayal. Either way, her legend did not die with her. It only grew stronger. In a world that still questions the role of women in power, Amina stood 5 centuries ago as proof that courage knows no gender. Her life was not a tale of waiting for permission. It was a declaration of purpose. If Hannibal was a symbol of African military intellect, Queen Amina was its fierce embodiment in feminine form. She didn't just rule, she rode, she conquered, she shattered the mold of what leadership looked like. And for generations of African girls and women, Amina remains more than a historical figure. She is a torch, a fire passed down, a reminder that the heart of a warrior beats just as loud beneath a queen's chest.
3. Sundiata Keita, the Lion King of Mali. From the dry plains of Zazzau, where Queen Amina galloped into glory, our journey moves west to the savannas of West Africa. Here, beneath the sun-drenched skies of what is now Mali, a legend was born, not from strength, but from struggle. His name was Sundiata Keita, and his story began not with power, but with pain. He was born weak, crippled, unable to walk for the first years of his life. In a culture that prized warriors and horsemen, Sundiata was mocked, doubted, even pitied. His father, King Magan Konfata of Niani, believed in the prophecy that his son would become a great ruler. But others in the court, including his stepmother Sasuma, saw only a broken boy. Yet it was that very pain that forged his spirit. Sundiata may have crawled as a child, but he listened, he learned, he watched the kingdom rise and fall. And then, one day, against all odds and all expectations, he stood, and the world would never be the same. After the death of his father, Sundiata and his mother were forced into exile by his stepbrother, who took the throne. As a young man, Sundiata wandered far from Niani, living among different tribes, learning new languages, forging alliances, and mastering the arts of war, diplomacy, and leadership. His exile was not a curse, it was preparation. Meanwhile, in the region of Soso, a tyrant named Sumanguru Kante had risen to power. He crushed smaller kingdoms, terrorized cities, and declared himself overlord of the Mandinka people. He was feared not just as a warrior, but as a sorcerer. No one dared challenge him, until Sundiata returned.
With the courage of a lion and the precision of a tactician, Sundiata began rallying the Mandinka clans, uniting scattered tribes and former rivals under one banner. His charisma, sharpened by years of humility and growth, brought together an alliance that stretched across West Africa. In 1235, at the Battle of Karina, the crippled boy turned warrior king met Sumangaru's forces on the battlefield. It was a clash of more than armies. It was a war for the soul of a people.
SUNDIATA's forces, though outnumbered and facing what many believed to be magical opposition, emerged victorious. The Zulu Kingdom was crushed, and SUNDIATA marched back into Nyani, not as an exile, but as emperor. He declared the founding of the Mali Empire, a kingdom that would become one of the largest and most prosperous in African history. But SUNDIATA was not just a warrior of the battlefield. He was a builder of systems. He created a government structure rooted in justice, merit, and loyalty. He respected local customs and established the MBANDE Charter, one of the world's earliest declarations of human rights. Trade flourished under his rule, and the empire became a center for gold, salt, and culture, attracting scholars, merchants, and poets from across Africa and beyond. He would reign for decades, and by the time he passed, he had laid the foundation for a golden age of West African civilization. His empire would one day be ruled by his descendants, including the famous Mansa Musa, who would become the richest man in recorded history. But none of that, none of Mali's glory, would have existed without the perseverance of one boy who refused to be defined by weakness. SUNDIATA's story is more than a tale of war. It is a triumph of resilience, a chronicle of becoming. From crawling in shame to roaring across battlefields, he showed the world that true strength is not just in the body, but in the heart that refuses to quit. The griots of Mali have sung his story for centuries, calling him the Lion of Mali, not for how he was born, but for what he became. His legacy roars not just through the empire he founded, but through the idea that destiny doesn't ask for permission. It waits for those bold enough to rise. And rise he did. 4. Queen Nzinga MBANDE, the Serpent of Angola. Where most warriors charge onto the battlefield with sword in hand, Queen Nzinga MBANDE fought with both words and weapons, mastering diplomacy by day, commanding armies by night. Her throne was not built on comfort or inheritance. It was carved through fire, betrayal, and the unrelenting pressure of colonization. She was born in 1583 into the royal family of the Zulu Kingdom, one of several powerful Central African states in what is now Angola. From an early age, Nzinga exhibited fierce intelligence and political savvy. Her name itself, Nzinga, comes from the Kimbundu verb, kujinga, meaning to twist or turn, a foreshadowing of the cunning and flexibility she would later wield with deadly precision. The 17th century was a time of immense danger for Central Africa. Portuguese forces were advancing inland from Luanda, fueled by the Atlantic slave trade and the hunger for land, gold, and power. They destabilized local kingdoms, forged and broke alliances at will, and kidnapped Africans to fill slave ships bound for the Americas. Into this chaos stepped Nzinga, not as a passive royal, but as a determined negotiator. In 1622, when her brother, the King of Ndongo, proved incapable of dealing with the Portuguese, he sent Nzinga to negotiate peace. And there, in Luanda, she delivered one of history's most unforgettable acts of political theater. As she entered the negotiation chamber, the Portuguese governor offered her no seat, clearly intending to assert dominance. Nzinga refused to be diminished. Instead, she ordered one of her servants to kneel and became her throne. She sat eye to eye with her colonizer and demanded justice for her people. But diplomacy was not enough. After the death of her brother, possibly by her own political design, Nzinga declared herself Queen of Ndongo,
despite resistance from male nobles. Then, when the Portuguese betrayed the peace, she retreated to the nearby kingdom of Matamba, assumed its throne as well, and transformed it into a base of resistance. There, she became the nucleus of one of the longest and most determined anti-colonial struggles in African history. NZINGA didn't just resist, she adapted. She formed alliances with former rivals. She adopted Catholicism to manipulate Portuguese politics, but maintained her indigenous spiritual identity. She offered sanctuary to escaped slaves and displaced warriors, forming a multiracial, multi-ethnic army that would battle the Portuguese for decades. She even built alliances with the Dutch, sworn enemies of the Portuguese, in a geopolitical chess game that confused and confounded European powers. Her forces practiced guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run raids, and ambushes deep in the Angolan forests. She moved her capital multiple times to avoid siege. She dressed in battle gear, led from the front lines, and inspired fierce loyalty for her troops. For over 30 years, NZINGA's resistance kept the Portuguese from total domination in Central Africa. Her ability to adapt, negotiate, fight, and survive in a constantly shifting political landscape earned her a fearsome nickname, the Serpent of Angola. To her enemies, she was slippery, unpredictable, and dangerous. To her people, she was a symbol of resilience, proof that African resistance was not just possible, but powerful. NZINGA ruled into her 60s, an extraordinary feat for a woman in wartime. Even when age crept into her bones, her mind remained razor-sharp. She eventually negotiated a truce that allowed her kingdom to remain intact, and upon her death in 1663, she left behind a legacy of strength, sovereignty, and relentless resistance. Today, Queen NZINGA is remembered not just in Angola, but across the African continent as a national heroine. Statues of her stand in Luanda, streets bear her name, and in every classroom where colonial history is studied, her story is slowly reclaiming its rightful place. NZINGA's genius was not only in her command of armies, it was in her understanding that resistance takes many forms: diplomacy, warfare, alliance, adaptation. She was the rare warrior who could change masks without changing her mission. In a world built to crush her, she refused to be bent. In an age designed to erase her, she wrote herself into legend. And so from the plains of Mali to the forests of Matamba, the warrior queen rides on, in memory, in defiance, and in the bloodline of African resistance.
5. Shaka Zulu, the warrior innovator. Where most men conquer kingdoms, Shaka Zulu created one from fire, discipline, and a vision the world had never seen before. His name still echoes across the hills of KwaZulu-Natal, not merely as a king, but as the architect of a military revolution. To understand Shaka is to understand how leadership, innovation, and raw willpower can carve an empire out of chaos. Born around 1787, Shaka was the illegitimate son of Senzanga Kona, chief of the Zulu clan. Rejected by his father and bullied by peers, he grew up in exile with his mother Nandi among the Metwa people. It was there, in the shadows of rejection, that Shaka began to harden. The pain of his early years would become the fuel of his ferocity, and when the time came to rise, he would not rise quietly. Serving as a warrior under Chief Dingiswayo of the Metwa, Shaka quickly distinguished himself, not just through brute strength, but through tactical brilliance. He observed, adapted, and soon began introducing new methods of warfare that shocked his elders.
He restructured the army into disciplined regiments based on age and skill, and introduced new weapons like the iklua, a short stabbing spear that replaced the traditional throwing spear. The iklua forced warriors into close combat, turning every fight into a test of discipline and nerve. But his most revolutionary invention? The buffalo horn formation. Shaka organized his troops into 3 components: the horns, flanking units that encircled the enemy; the chest, the main attacking force; and the loins, reserves who delivered the final blow. This tactic didn't just defeat enemies, it swallowed them. When his father died, Shaka claimed leadership of the Zulu clan, then a relatively small group. But in less than a decade, through military conquest, strategic marriages, and ruthless consolidation, Shaka transformed the Zulu into a fearsome empire. He absorbed or annihilated rival tribes, reorganized societies, and installed loyal commanders across the region. His campaign sparked what historians now call the Methekane, the crushing, a period of mass migrations, wars, and political upheaval across South Africa, triggered by Shaka's explosive rise. But Shaka was not just a tactician. He was a charismatic, complex leader. His soldiers were fanatically loyal, living in military kraals, forbidden to marry until retirement, and trained to endure extreme hardship. They walked barefoot across thorns and rocks to toughen their feet. They practiced endless drills. They moved as one. Shaka turned warriors into a machine. Yet, like many great rulers, his brilliance came with brutality. His punishments were harsh. His grief was volcanic, especially after the death of his mother Nandi, which plunged him into a spiral of mourning and madness. He ordered mass executions, banned farming for a year, and demanded that no milk be consumed as a sign of national grief. These decisions sowed seeds of fear and resentment. In 1828, Shaka was assassinated by his half-brothers Dingane and Mithangana, betrayed by those who once stood in his shadow. But by then, the Zulu Kingdom was a juggernaut. His military legacy had spread far beyond the boundaries of his homeland, influencing generations of warfare, both within Africa and beyond. Even the British, decades later, during the Anglo-Zulu War, would struggle against Zulu forces shaped by the foundation Shaka laid. The Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, where Zulu warriors defeated a British force, was a thunderclap that reminded the world of what Shaka had created. Today, monuments to Shaka Zulu stand tall, and his name lives on not only in South African history, but in military academies across the globe. His methods are studied, his tactics are admired, and his spirit remains a symbol of African ingenuity, resistance, and state-building. Shaka didn't just fight wars, he changed the way wars were fought. He didn't inherit an empire, he imagined it and then forged it with fire and discipline. From outcast to overlord, from exile to emperor, Shaka Zulu was the ultimate warrior innovator. A storm no one saw coming, and one that South Africa and the world will never forget.
6. Yaa Asantewaa, the spirit of Ashanti resistance. In the twilight of the 19th century, when the British Empire stretched its arms deep into West Africa, it came face to face with a force it had never anticipated, a queen mother who would not be moved. Yaa Asantewaa, the queen mother of the Ashanti Empire's Ejiso state in present-day Ghana, did not wear armor forged in steel. Her power came not from the battlefield, but from the throne of maternal leadership, the sacred stool of her ancestors, and an unshakable belief that her people must never surrender their dignity. Born around 1840, Yaa Asantewaa lived during a time of political unrest within the Ashanti Empire. As the British tightened their grip on the Gold Coast, they sought to dismantle the Ashanti Kingdom, piece by piece. Their most symbolic act of domination came in 1900 when they demanded possession of the Golden Stool, the sacred throne of the Ashanti people, believed to house the soul of the nation. To the Ashanti, the Golden Stool was no mere artifact. It was the embodiment of their identity, their kingship, their ancestors' spirits. To demand it was not just offensive, it was war. When the Ashanti leaders hesitated, worn down by years of conflict, tired of seeing their chiefs exiled, Yaa Asantewaa stood up and thundered, words that would ripple through history. If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will fight. We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefields. Those weren't empty words. She wasn't issuing a poetic challenge. She was launching a revolution. At over 60 years old, Yaa Asantewaa took command of the Ashanti army, the first and only woman in Ashanti history to do so. She led over 5,000 warriors into what would become known as the War of the Golden Stool. Her forces laid siege to the British fort in Kumasi for months. Though armed mostly with traditional weapons, muskets, knives, and unmatched courage, they outmaneuvered and outlasted the British troops far longer than expected. Yaa Asantewaa's knowledge of terrain, her fiery speeches, and her refusal to retreat made her a living symbol of African resistance. She rallied not only soldiers, but the souls of a people. For every battle cry she raised, she awakened a deeper defiance within the hearts of her warriors. Women sang war songs in her honor. Greece began to weave her name into the oral tradition. She wasn't just a commander, she was a mother defending her children, every child of Ashanti soil. Eventually, British reinforcements arrived and the siege was broken. Yaa Asantewaa was captured and exiled to the Seychelles, where she died in 2021. She never saw her homeland again. But the story doesn't end there. Though the British won that war, they lost something far greater: moral ground. Yaa Asantewaa's resistance ignited a wave of consciousness throughout the continent. She became an icon of Pan-Africanism, a figure studied by liberation leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and even the ANC in South Africa. In Ghana today, her name is honored in schools, monuments, and national history. Her image adorns murals and stages during cultural festivals. Her memory continues to walk boldly in the hearts of African daughters who still rise, still resist, and still lead. She didn't need a sword to carve her name into the chronicles of African greatness. She didn't need royal blood to rule. She needed courage, conviction, and the fire to protect her people's soul. Yaa Asantewaa fought not just for a stool, but for a story, the right of a people to write their own future. And even in exile, her echo remained: "If you will not fight, we will."
Samori Touré, the last emperor of resistance. In the vast savannas and dense forests of 19th century West Africa, few names carried the weight that Samori Touré did. To the French, he was a stubborn nuisance. To his people, he was a defender of sovereignty. But in the annals of African history, he stands as one of the last great emperors to wage war against colonialism on African soil, and nearly win. Born around 1830 in present-day Guinea, Samori Touré came from humble beginnings. His early years were shaped not in palaces, but on the rugged terrain of Mande country. He learns trade, tactics, and tribal politics. When his mother was captured by a rival group, young Samori bartered his own freedom in exchange for hers, and then spent years rising through the ranks to become a warrior and military leader of extraordinary skill. By the 1870s, Samori had carved out a powerful kingdom, the Wasulu Empire, stretching across parts of Guinea, Mali, Ivory Coast, and Sierra Leone. His rise wasn't just through conquest, it was strategic and ideological. Samori organized a standing army of over 30,000 men, structured into infantry and cavalry units, and trained using modern tactics he learned through contact with both African rivals and European observers. But his greatest trial came not from African neighbors, it came from the French, whose ambitions to control West Africa collided directly with his territory. The French expected quick victories. Instead, they got drawn into a prolonged and painful war. From 1882 to 1898, Samori Touré led one of the longest and most complex resistance campaigns in African colonial history. His forces fought guerrilla-style and open-field battles. He used scorched earth tactics, destroyed crops and towns to deny the French resources, and continuously moved his capital to elude capture. When faced with superior European weaponry, Samori established his own weapons manufacturing centers. He sent envoys to Sierra Leone and Liberia to trade for guns. He even adapted Islamic teachings and governance to unify the diverse peoples under his rule, offering them not only military defense but spiritual purpose. To the French, this was a nightmare. To West Africans watching from the sidelines, Samori Touré became a symbol of defiance, unity, and pride. But resistance on such a scale came at a great cost. His people were tired, resources ran thin, European reinforcements grew. And in 1898, after nearly a decade of warfare, Samori was captured and exiled to Gabon. He died in 1000. Yet just like Yaa Asantewaa, his defeat did not silence his legacy. Samori Touré left behind a blueprint of organized resistance. He showed that Africans were not mere victims of conquest, but intellectual, spiritual, and military equals of any force that came against them. His Wasulu Empire was not just a wartime machine, it was a functioning state built on vision and strategic governance. Today, in Guinea and beyond, his name is invoked alongside the greats of African resistance. He is remembered as a Pan-African forerunner, a man who stood against empire not for the sake of pride, but for the right of his people to determine their own destiny. And perhaps his greatest legacy, his great-grandson, Ahmed Sékou Touré, would become Guinea's first president after independence from France in 1958, continuing the legacy of resistance, sovereignty, and African leadership that Samori had once embodied with fire and steel. Samori Touré didn't merely fight for land. He fought for dignity, identity, and the dream that African empires could live and breathe on their own terms. He was an emperor of warriors, a general of the people, and a symbol of how long one man will run when freedom is calling.
8. BEHANZIN of Dahomey, the shark who fought the French. Deep in the lush lands of present-day Benin, where the Atlantic breeze meets dense forests, the Kingdom of Dahomey stood as a bastion of African strength and military prowess. At its helm in the late 19th century was BEHANZIN, the last independent king of Dahomey, a ruler whose courage and defiance earned him the chilling nickname, the Shark. BEHANZIN inherited a kingdom famed for its fierce warriors, especially the all-female elite corps known as the Dahomey Amazons, feared across West Africa for their skill and ferocity. The Dahomey military was highly disciplined, organized, and brutal, a true force to be reckoned with.
But by the time BEHANZIN ascended to the throne in 1889, European imperial powers, particularly France, had their eyes set on Dahomey's rich lands. BEHANZIN understood what was at stake. He was not a king who would bow or negotiate from weakness. Instead, he prepared his kingdom for war, arming his troops with modern rifles, drilling them relentlessly, and weaving a web of alliances among neighboring peoples. The ensuing conflict, known as the Second Franco-Dahomeyan War, 1892 to 1894, was a brutal struggle for sovereignty. BEHANZIN's forces fought fiercely against the better-equipped French colonial army, utilizing guerrilla tactics and leveraging their deep knowledge of local terrain. The Dahomey Amazons led many of the key battles, their fearless charges cutting through enemy lines and earning respect even from their European foes. Despite their valiant resistance, the French forces gradually wore down Dahomey's defenses. The siege of the capital Abomey and relentless campaigns exhausted the kingdom. In 1894, BEHANZIN was captured and exiled to Martinique, where he lived out his days away from his homeland. But even in exile, BEHANZIN's spirit never broke. He remained a symbol of unwavering resistance to colonial domination, a shark that refused to be caught. His story inspired generations to remember that Africa's fight against imperialism was not passive, but fierce and determined. The legacy of BEHANZIN and the Dahomey Amazons lives on today in the rich cultural heritage of Benin and in the collective memory of African resistance fighters. Museums, art, and oral histories celebrate their bravery and tactical brilliance. BEHANZIN's reign may have ended with exile, but his roar remains, echoing the indomitable will of a king who fought tooth and nail to defend his people's freedom.
9. Muhammad Ahmad, the Mahdi, the spiritual warrior of Sudan. In the vast deserts and river valleys of Sudan, a prophetic voice rose in the late 19th century, one that combined religious fervor with military might, sparking one of the most dramatic anti-colonial revolts in African history. His name was Muhammad Ahmad, but he is better known as the Mahdi, meaning the Guided One. Born in 1844, Muhammad Ahmad was a religious scholar deeply concerned by the corruption and weakness he perceived in the ruling Turco-Egyptian administration and the growing influence of European powers in Sudan. Claiming to be the Mahdi prophesied in Islamic tradition, he called upon the people to reject foreign domination and return to pure Islamic values. But Muhammad Ahmad was more than a spiritual leader. He was a masterful organizer and military commander. Beginning in 1881, he mobilized a diverse coalition of tribes and warriors, uniting previously fragmented groups under his banner. His movement was rooted in both religious revivalism and fierce nationalism, inspiring followers with the promise of liberation and divine justice. His forces employed guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and highly mobile cavalry raids, catching their enemies off guard. The modest army grew rapidly, and by 1885, it had captured Khartoum, the seat of Egyptian power, famously defeating and killing the British general Charles Gordon in the process. This victory marked a watershed moment. For over a decade, the modest state controlled much of Sudan, resisting European attempts at reconquest. Muhammad Ahmad's leadership was charismatic and uncompromising. He combined spiritual authority with military command, enforcing strict discipline among his followers and inspiring unshakable loyalty. His rule sought to establish a society based on Islamic law and social justice, aiming to rebuild Sudan free from foreign control. However, his reign was short-lived. Muhammad Ahmad died in 1885, just months after the fall of Khartoum. His successor, the Caliph Abdullahi,
continued resistance that eventually succumbed to British-Egyptian forces in 1898. Still, the Mahdi's legacy endures. He demonstrated how spiritual leadership could galvanize a people into armed resistance. His uprising challenged European imperialism in Africa at a time when many other regions were falling under colonial rule. His vision inspired later nationalist and religious movements throughout the continent. In Sudan today, Muhammad Ahmad is remembered as a national hero, a symbol of resistance, faith, and unity against foreign domination. The Mahdi was not just a warrior with sword and spear. He was a warrior of the spirit, a leader who wielded belief as powerfully as any army. He reminded the world that freedom is won not only on battlefields, but in hearts and minds.
10. CETSHWAYO KAMPANDE, the Lion of the Zulu Nation. As our journey through Africa's greatest warriors draws to a close, we return to the fierce battlefields of southern Africa, where the echoes of one final lion roar still thunder in history's halls. CETSHWAYO KAMPANDE, the Zulu king who stood defiantly against British imperialism in the late 19th century. Born into the royal family around 1826, CETSHWAYO inherited not just a kingdom, but the weight of legacy. The son of MBANDE and nephew of the legendary Shaka Zulu, he grew up immersed in a culture of warrior discipline, strategic innovation, and unyielding pride. When CETSHWAYO ascended the throne in 1872, the Zulu nation was a powerful but increasingly threatened kingdom. The British Empire was expanding aggressively, seeking to control South Africa's rich lands and resources. Diplomacy and treaties failed to hold back the tide of colonial ambition. In 1879, conflict erupted in what would become the Anglo-Zulu War, a brutal confrontation pitting the well-armed British forces against the disciplined and battle-hardened Zulu warriors. CETSHWAYO was not just a symbolic figurehead. He personally commanded his forces and planned strategies that would stun a world. At the Battle of Yaa Asantewaa, CETSHWAYO delivered one of the greatest defeats ever suffered by a modern European army at the hands of indigenous forces. Using the famous buffalo horn formation developed by Shaka decades earlier, the Zulu encircled and annihilated a British column, killing over 1,300 soldiers. The victory shocked Britain and the world, proving that African warriors were formidable, disciplined, and capable of defeating imperial powers on their own soil. Yet CETSHWAYO's success was not just in this battle. He led his nation through a difficult war marked by fierce fighting, shifting alliances, and immense loss. He sought to preserve the Zulu nation's independence and culture against overwhelming odds. Despite this, British reinforcements eventually turned the tide. CETSHWAYO was captured in 1883 and exiled to Cape Town, a bitter symbol of the fall of Zulu independence. But even in defeat, his legacy endured. CETSHWAYO's leadership during the Anglo-Zulu War remains a testament to the strength and resilience of African resistance to colonial conquest. His ability to unite a vast nation and mobilize an army capable of stunning victories has inspired generations of African leaders and warriors. Today, CETSHWAYO is celebrated as a hero in South Africa and beyond, a symbol of courage, strategic brilliance, and unwavering commitment to freedom. His story reminds us that the fight for dignity is not always won by the strongest weapons or largest armies, but by leaders who inspire their people to stand as one. CETSHWAYO was a lion among warriors, a king who roared in defiance when empires threatened to silence him, and his roar still echoes. From the soaring peaks of Carthage to the sun-drenched savannas of Mali, the dense forests of Angola, and the rolling hills of southern Africa, the stories of Africa's greatest warriors reveal a continent rich with courage, innovation, and unbreakable spirit. These 10 warriors, Hannibal Barca, Queen Amina of Zazzau, SUNDIATA KEITA, Queen NZINGA, Shaka Zulu, Yaa Asantewaa, Samori Touré, BEHANZIN of Dahomey, Muhammad Ahmad the Mahdi, and SETSHWAYO KAMPANDE were more than fighters. They were visionaries. They were leaders who understood that true power springs from the hearts of their people and the strength of their convictions. Each of them faced overwhelming odds. They confronted invading armies, colonial empires, internal strife, and cultural upheaval. Yet time and again they rose, sometimes victorious, sometimes exiled, sometimes fallen, but always remembered. Their weapons were not just swords and spears, but wisdom, diplomacy, resilience, and a fierce love for their lands and peoples. They shattered the myths that Africa was a passive victim of history and instead carved their names into the very foundation of global resistance and leadership. What connects them across centuries and geography is their unwavering refusal to accept domination. They challenged the status quo and, in many cases, changed the course of history, not just for their nations, but for all of Africa. Today, their stories inspire a new generation of leaders, fighters, and dreamers. In classrooms, on battlefields, in boardrooms, and in the hearts of millions, their legacy pulses as a reminder: greatness is born in the struggle, and freedom is won by those who dare to fight for it. So as we close this chapter of history, let us remember these warriors not just as figures of the past, but as living symbols of strength, courage, and the enduring power of the African spirit. Their battles may have been fought long ago, but their roar is louder than ever.